I know a lot of people have a real big hatred for Nepo babies.
I'm sorry. If you'd like to talk about this in a respectful manner.
Drive-by movies you're watching.
Fresh releases.
My name's Blaise.
And I am James.
And this week we're talking the latest Cronenberg film, Humane.
We can get through this, but we have to stick together.
You mentioned before we cut to the clips of the movie, Cronenberg, but which Cronenberg, you might ask? This is from Caitlin Cronenberg, the first time making her feature onto our show. This movie is about in the wake of an environmental collapse that is forcing humanity to shed 20% of its population. Family dinner erupts into chaos when a father's plan to enlist in the government's new euthanasia program goes horribly wrong. Quite a concept, and perfect for indie films. This is reminiscent of some of the best thrillers we've gotten over the last 10 to 20 years. Some of my favorite movies that were these are the indie thrillers that I was looking forward to. Ones where it just takes place in one location with a high fun concept but goes to great places. I think of movies like The Invitation, great movie that a lot of people still remember from Netflix. Back when streaming was slowly starting to become a mainstream thing. That was one of the first movies where we kept telling people you got to check out that movie. And this movie I'm not saying that this movie is an inspiration or came from that, but it just has that same vibe, but does it execute it properly? Blaise, what were your thoughts coming out of it?
Yeah, I have to agree. I think this film did the idea of making something kind of smaller. It's got the idea of only one location. It's set in a house very similar to The Invitation and the first Purge. Not the first Purge, but the first Purge film in the series. Isn't there a Purge film called The First Purge?
Yes, there is. So yeah, there's The Purge, the original first movie, and then there is The First Purge, a prequel that was the second to last of the franchise, I think.
And I'm assuming that probably has more than one location. It's not, the first film.
I don't know. I stopped after the first movie. But I don't want to lead you on, though. So, I was praising its premise. However, I do not like this movie at all. I'm not sure how your thoughts are on the movie, but we'll get into why I didn't like it. But it's a fun concept. Parts of it do work, but just overall, I just found the movie kind of patronizing, especially coming from someone who has money. And this movie has a lot to do with wealth. So it was just okay, we get it. I agree with what you're saying within this movie, but it just overall, just the whole movie, I was just kind of eye rolling. But yeah.
I did love this premise. I thought the premise was really cool. I thought it was pretty inventive. It was something I felt like I hadn't seen before when I was watching it. And then it kind of makes way too many references to actually what's going on at modern day, where it's oh, this thing, oh, the China virus or stuff like that. They're making obvious references to where I'm I wish you would actually be a little bit more science fiction instead of just blatantly. It reminded me very much of that one film that was kind of trying to be this, where it was was it The Hunt? Was that the movie I'm thinking of? Where they tried to do a very kind of similar style. It wasn't similar to politics in current day and how divisive and volatile
right.
It is. Not similar concept wise, but just similar in the same way where it's very divisive and just leaning into how volatile politics have become, and then kind of make a fun twist out of it. They do the same thing, but it felt as the film went on, I became less enamored with the concept and just more okay, get to the point. There was little things where I feel they had introduced, and then the way they executed just wasn't necessarily the way that I feel it deserved an execution. One of the things I'll mention is I thought that the character of Bob, it definitely was somebody I could see who was just kind of I hadn't recognized this guy before, the guy who played that character, but it just felt like a cheap Michael Ironside or somebody of that ilk, and where I feel somebody like Michael Ironside would lend a little bit more to the character than just being there for laughs, because I felt that character kind of took the movie out for me. I know it is a comedy, but I did kind of want that more science fiction horror approach. This film never really lends itself to being a horror movie, but I kind of wanted that movie versus, you know, just the comedy where it's poking fun at reality, where at the end of the day, once the film's over, you're like, I'm not escaping like the reality in which when I watch a movie, I'm trying to escape, you know, the reality and volatile politics, where it's at the end of this, I'm just reminded of like what is really outside.
Right. And, you know, like, I don't want any of our audience to think that, like, you know, you know, this movie's too real, that's why we didn't like it. We know that most science fiction movies, whether it's Star Wars or Blade Runner or, you know, something way more complicated, like, I don't know, like something like Arrival or something, maybe not complicated was the wrong word to say, but, you know, something more artsy, I guess you could say. Like, you know, we're always familiar with the concept of like science fiction always relating to, you know, some kind of political agenda and like, you know, just having it used as a metaphor for a lot of stuff. That's very common with science sci-fi, and that's what I love about the genre, honestly. But just, it's not that this movie was like patronizing, it was just a little too much in a small runtime when, you know, just like, also if you're gonna have like this kind of go in that horror genre, even though I wouldn't classify this movie as a horror, it's a Shudder exclusive, so a lot of people might automatically think it's a horror film. One thing to keep in mind with Shudder, not everything on there is legitimately horror. A lot of stuff like works in that favor, but yeah, I guess like it was trying a little bit too many things, and when we try to go into more body horror gore-esque scenes, I was just like, well, I need a character to root for within this movie, and there really isn't anyone. They try to with one of the siblings within the movie, but, you know, at the end of the day, there isn't enough backstory or like any motivation for me to really care, other than just like, okay, he's turned his life around and he has like someone that he loves and cares for a lot. Like, that's the character you're supposed to be rooting for. But just I just felt like, what was the point over this movie? And literally forgot about it right when I finished it, because right after I was like, oh, I gotta fold laundry and head to work soon. So it's one of those movies where I literally just forgot about it, and then I was like, 12 hours later, I'm like, oh yeah, we're reviewing it, and what was it about again? Okay.
I was rooting for Peter Gallagher's character, but he exits the movie pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, yeah. It was nice seeing him. I haven't seen him really in anything other than Mr. Deeds. Like, I know of all things, that's a weird thing to remember him from, but I was like, oh, it's the dude from Mr. Deeds. But yeah, I mean, of course, he kind of messes up like everything for his family and kind of leaves them in a sticky situation. But, you know, that's what you get for not reading the fine print. But yeah.
Yeah, I liked that concept. I thought that was like, it was like kind of funny. I liked that it had moments there in the beginning where it's like, it kind of keeps escalating in a sense. But I feel like once they get to that point of like, oh, somebody's going to have to make a choice, like who's gonna you know, forfeit their life so that the rest of them can keep living. But then it kind of wants to become like this, I guess, like thriller. It's not really horror, but it's like kind of like thriller, I guess, because you're right, you're not really rooting for a character specifically. You know who the bad characters are in the movie, and then with just the character of Bob is just like kind of so outlandishly comedic, it just felt like tonally off. Like, it just didn't work really tonally, and I feel like they needed to kind of either go full sci-fi genre, like interesting, or go full comedy critique, like don't be kind of serious at all. Because I feel like just teetering that line, that this might not have been the easiest first movie to kind of, your first feature film to direct, really, or first big feature. I'm not sure really what Caitlin Cronenberg's done before this, so I don't want to speak out of line, but I do feel like maybe this might have been a more difficult film to enter. And then when it does have those kind of, like you mentioned earlier, the body horror elements, it does feel like those are almost shoehorned in solely because of your last name.
I think honestly they should have just started that aspect of the movie earlier to, you know, set the stakes up a little bit higher, because the whole movie I was wondering when finally it turns into, you know, minor spoilers, but when it turns into fight or flight mode, when they're gonna fight back, the whole movie I was just like, why don't you just fight back them? Like, why are y'all fighting amongst each other? and stuff. So, you know, and when they finally decide that towards the end, I was like, too little, too effing late, honestly. So I just didn't really care and stuff. But, you know, I don't want to like bring down Caitlin Cronenberg too bad, because, you know, I know a lot of people have a real big hatred for Nepo babies and stuff too. And, you know, a lot of the times, like, you know, I can't stand people who like, you know, didn't work in the business or didn't like work their way up. But, you know, people like Brandon Cronenberg are great filmmakers, and, you know, there's plenty of other that Hollywood's one of the hardest businesses to make it in and stuff too. And, you know, if you have a lucky family member that made it, then go for it by all means, but just make sure you have something to say. And, you know, I don't want to bring down Caitlin Cronenberg. I just say that, unfortunately, just like, I think this is her feature debut. I know she did like a short called like The Death of David Cronenberg. You know, I don't like, this is just not the best like feature debut to make it on Shudder, and it's a bummer because, you know, I know that like Brandon Cronenberg, I never saw his first film, but you know, coming swinging hard with like Possessor was just like, oh man, what a movie.
Definitely, yeah. I think that this film at least showed some promise there. Maybe she can harness her talent going forward. I mean, we know she's gonna get a second, third, or even third shot, regardless of how this film did. So it's not like you know, her film career is gonna be completely buried just because maybe this movie wasn't a critical success. I think this movie has pretty mixed critical reviews as is. So I don't think that, like, you know, a divisive movie by critics doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, your career is done when your dad's like one of the masters of horror. So I feel like, you know, this showed enough little promising things there that the beginning definitely had me. I think at least thing you can say is like that the concept was original to, you know, begin with. Maybe it kind of devolves into stuff that felt like kind of derivative, but I do feel like at least, you know, the concept does, you know, have some semblance of, you know, an original movie. It just didn't feel entirely derivative of her dad's career, kind of like how M. Night Shyamalan's daughter directed The Watcher, which felt like, you know, is it The Watchers actually? I think it's The Watchers. It felt like just, you know, like an offshoot of something that M. Night Shyamalan would pass on. So this didn't totally feel like this. This didn't feel like a Cronenberg movie, really. So I guess that's, you know, a huge plus.
Right, yeah. And again, this is a movie that's like not by all bad by any means. I guess it's just the way I'm wording it is, had a great concept, but just the execution wasn't there for me. Could have been much better. You know, am I wrong or am I right? You know, let us know in the comments below what you thought about the movie. It's on Shudder. You could also rent it through our Amazon affiliate link in our description box below. Talking about it or renting it is a great way to help support the show.
And if you guys haven't already, go ahead and smash that like button, hit the subscribe button, and click that notification bell to get all our latest updates.
And speaking of updates, all our social media links are down below. We got Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and our own personal letterbox accounts. That'll conclude this week's episode. Tune in next week for a brand new video.